Welcome everyone to the session. My name's Rosie Ellis. I'm the exec lead for the National Suicide Prevention Alliance, and I will be chairing the session today. We've got three fantastic speakers joining us today. So we have Alice Brockway, who is an NSPA Lived Experience Influencer, Jeremy O'Dwyer, also an NSPA Lived Experience Influencer, and we're joined by Steve Gilbert as well, who's an anti-racism consultant and a person with lived experience. And Steve was actually also involved in setting up our lived experience network. So I'm delighted to have the three speakers with us today, and they'll introduce themselves in more detail shortly. We've also got some of the NSPA team joining us today, and they'll be in the background helping to manage the session. So please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. I can see that some people are doing that already. The team are on hand and will kind of engage in the chat as well in case there's any issues or anything that comes up. So a bit of housekeeping for today then. I think first and foremost, we just want to ask people to remember to be considerate, respectful and kind to each other in the chat. You know, we are kind of talking about a difficult topic today, and you know, we're going to be hearing about some personal experiences following a suicide attempt. So just to be mindful of that. And also, given the sort of nature of what we're talking about today, and talking about attempting suicide, and that, you know, there may well be many of you in the audience of the webinar who have your own personal experience, or perhaps sharing professional experiences. Please be mindful of just thinking about what you're sharing and not sharing distressing details, and particularly being mindful to talking about means and methods of suicide. So not doing that in line with guidance on how we talk about suicide. Also just want to kind of flag, you know, please be kind and take time for your own well-being today. As I say, you might well feel affected by some of what you hear, and you know, we'll be touching on some difficult themes. So just a reminder about your well-being, really, and I think the team will put some information in the chat about support that you can access, but of course, you know, you can always step away from the webinar at any point if you'd like to. As I said before, we're recording the session, so you can also watch it at a later date if you'd like to. So just to sort of bring us to what we're talking about today, this is a webinar that's been part of a series actually since World Suicide Prevention Day last year. We've been running a campaign shining a light on the stigma of suicide, and we've been looking at different experiences, different communities' experiences of stigma following a suicide. We've been thinking about the language that we use and sort of being mindful about, you know, not being inadvertently stigmatizing in how we talk about suicide. So you can access, we've got a campaign hub that's been running since we launched last year. So you can access kind of previous sessions and kind of blogs and things we put out around the stigma of suicide. But today we want to focus specifically on hearing from people who have experience of attempting suicide and the stigma that they've may have experienced, the impact that's had. But we do also, you know, we may well be, the speakers will also reflect on some positive experiences that they've had. Really, the aims of the session today are, rather than kind of being we're giving you some information about these are the things that you can do and this is how services should be run. It is going to be a panel discussion format. It's going to be quite reflective. We want to create some space to explore the stigma experienced by people who have attempted suicide. And we want to get you as in the audience to reflect on actually how sort of the impact that stigma can have, and how family, friends, professional services systems all of these things can play a part in how somebody is supported when in crisis and following a suicide attempt. So it is quite a reflective session. I think really important to acknowledge that the session will talk about experiences of suicide. Some of the issues raised may bring up uncomfortable feelings. I think what we'd like to encourage you in the audience is to lean into this conversation and hold space for the presenters' reflections on their experiences. And then I think the other point to make, and then I'll kind of move us into our main session, so we can hear from the speakers. But I think important to say that sometimes we can sort of, I suppose, homogenize groups of people and kind of homogenize kind of communities' experiences. So today is very much about thinking about the many different experiences and perspectives that people who have attempted suicide may have. So I think that's enough from me in terms of sort of laying a bit of context for the session. And so now I think it'd be great to, we're going to start with some brief introductions from each of our panel to tell us a little bit about themselves and why they're here to talk to us today. And then we're going to move into 3 questions. So I think I'll start with Alice, if that's all right, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Hi, I'm Alice. I'm one of the NSPA Lived Experience Influencers. I was in the first cohort who trained with Steve, so it's lovely to be on a panel with him. My background is in the performing arts. I trained as an actor and worked professionally. I've been a theatre maker, creative workshop leader type. I've moved more recently into mental health work, and I'm currently working on a PhD looking at mental health in actors, as well as industry work, sort of looking at mental health in performing arts workers. My lived experience around suicide is both as a survivor and as someone caring for people with suicidality. My most recent suicide attempt was around 6 months ago, so this is all quite close for me this time. And yeah, I'm just looking forward to this discussion and seeing what comes out.
Thank you so much, Alice. Steve, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, and thank you for having me. Yeah, so I'm Steve Gilbert. And just to kind of give some framing to kind of my experiences. So I've had periods of major depressive episodes, going back to 2008 and 2009, multiple attempts on my life, had a manic episode where I ended up sectioned under Section 136 and then under Section 2 of the Mental Health Act. And then I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. So I'm very much a patient of mental health services and still am. Quite important for these discussions. I'm of dual ethnicity, so I've got both my parents are British, but I've got a white mother and a black father. So again, the conversation around how do we even discuss issues like suicide within marginalized and racialized communities is a really important one. And for me, I very much identify with the identity of a suicide attempt survivor. And just as it's vital that we've worked with people who've bereaved by suicide, and how we've learned how to best support and to keep them safe and to have them involved at all levels in suicide prevention policy, we've got to do a much better job of working with people who have either lived with suicidal thoughts, have planned or made attempts to take their own lives. So I use the term suicide attempt survivors to kind of describe those experiences. And for me, the meaningful involvement of suicide attempt survivors has to continue to get stronger in informing national policies. And part of that is because there's a unique perspective and insight that can really enrich the discussions that we're already having, and enable that deeper understanding of what what we need to do to really get effective strategies, not just for kind of the immediacy of when someone's in a crisis, but actually what's going on in the, you know, the hours, the days, the weeks, the months in advance of that.
Thanks, Steve, so much. That's really helpful, just further contextualising the session. And Jeremy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and great to be here with you this afternoon on this webinar. My career, spanning some 40 plus years, is a mix of both private and public sector. And through that time, suffered with depression and mental illness for quite a few years, undiagnosed for a long while. And my role as a influencer is based on the fact that I attempted suicide about 14, 15 years ago now. And I also include in my sharing of the story family. To me, my family is very important, but share also the impact that my illness and my attempt had on them. I've spent the last 10 years or so sharing my story to a broad range of organisations and audiences, and deliver mental health first aid training and suicide prevention training, and been a lived experience influencer now for about 2 years now. So not as experienced as Steve and Alice, but it's great to be here. And my interest in all things mental well-being are such that at the age of 65 decided it was time to go back to university, and on top of my work I'm now studying for a degree in psychology, which I found really helpful. So yeah, that's me.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jeremy, and thanks to all three of our speakers for sort of sharing a bit about themselves and their experience, and talking about yes, what brings them presenting at our, or talking at our webinar today. And just so I've just seen some conversation in the chat about questions, and I think I forgot to mention that actually. So we do have, although I can see the team have posted about this, we do have a separate Q&A box. So if you've got questions that you want to put to the speakers once we've kind of had our panel discussion, please do pop them in there. It's just easier for us to see them then, because I'm sure there'll be some discussion that gets going in the chat as we move through the webinar. So yes, thank you for those introductions. What we're going to do now is have a panel style discussion. We've got 3 questions that we're going to be posing to our speakers today, and we've got about 50 minutes for that, so we can get some good discussion going. And then we've factored in sort of around 15 minutes for questions from you in the audience at the end of our kind of main part of the session, and then we'll kind of have a 5-minute close. I think one thing just to acknowledge is for those of you, well, hopefully everyone that signed up, you'll know that we pose some questions to you in terms of expectations for the webinar and any questions you might want to pose. So we've tried to have a look at those and kind of pull out some key themes. And I think what was quite striking in a couple of the key themes that came out was this sort of question around how do we have conversations, and sort of anxiety about, you know, saying the right thing. How do we speak about this sensitive subject? And then also questions that came up around sort of support systems, networks around a person. What role do friends and family play, and kind of thinking about that element of support. So they're going to be 2 themes that we do focus a bit on today. There were some other themes that came up around, well, what does this mean for services, and what do we do in terms of suicide prevention activities? We're not necessarily going to go into that specifically today. I think probably through the conversation, hopefully any of those of you in the audience that may be running services, hopefully this session will give you some food for thought, for things to think about. But we're definitely taking away thinking about additional content or things we could offer around more specifically that's service focused. But today we're going to focus on hearing from our speakers and their experiences. So I will move into our questions. So if I keep looking away from the screen, I'm just going to my notes to make sure I'm covering everything. So the first question that we have is, and we're going to go to Jeremy for this question first. Jeremy, can you tell us a bit more about the experiences you've had as a suicide attempt survivor and the impact that that's had on you?
Thank you. It's fair to say, just to put this in a bit of context, the majority of reactions I had to my suicide attempt were very positive, particularly from my immediate family and extended family. However, there were two stigmatizing experiences that I will share with you, one from a work environment and one from private environment. I was off work for about 6 months after my suicide attempt and kind of put under pressure to get back to work. On getting back to work, I was seen by a colleague who I knew reasonably well, and the reaction from that person was really brutal. I was called some quite unpleasant names based on the person's thoughts about what I had done to my family through that suicide attempt. It was devastating because within the 6 months initial recovery period, on the whole, all I had received was very positive affirmation and support. So out of the blue, to be suddenly faced with that really negative criticism really knocked my confidence for 6. Sadly, I never got the opportunity to talk with that person about why they were so bitter and angry towards me as a person, because I was just so shell-shocked by it. The other experience to share with you was from somebody that I thought was a very close friend, and arriving home from hospital. So the suicide attempt was quite fresh. I obviously started needing to address many aspects of my life and phoned this friend and asked him to come to the house so that we could have a conversation about what had gone on. And he pushed me to tell him on the phone. And despite my saying, well, no, I'd really rather you come to the house so we can have a face-to-face chat about it, there was a lot of coercion there. And in the end, I told him that not long home, having attempted suicide. That telephone conversation ended. And I've never seen or heard from that person since. And that's over 14 years ago now. We've never been in contact. And to be treated like that by somebody that I thought up until that point was a close friend was horrible, because I was looking for support and care, and what I received was the exact opposite. So there's two very distinct examples of stigmatizing behavior that I've experienced.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Jeremy. And yeah, they're kind of, and I saw that a question had come up around workplace responses, actually, which we can come on to for questions at the end. And I wonder if you've sort of reflected at all, Jeremy, just as a follow-up question, actually, maybe in terms of, you know, both of those interactions that you describe, what would have been more helpful in those situations for you?
Certainly from my friend, just basic care and support would have made a world of difference. The impact was to make me feel very lonely, very isolated, when what I was doing was reaching out to people that I thought were going to be able to help me in my recovery, which is what I needed, what I wanted. From the work perspective, I didn't know what to make of that initially. The person ought to have known better because of the nature of their role within the organisation, but it certainly made my return to work. I felt a lot more apprehensive, quite fearful about what's the next person going to say? You know, what are people thinking about me? Are people talking about me behind my back? And is a lot of it negative gossip? Of course, people were going to be talking about me. But the consequence of that abuse was a fear that everybody would be thinking like that about me. And yeah, that wasn't good.
Thank you, Jeremy, for sharing that, and you know, what sound like incredibly distressing and difficult experiences, which, as you say, kind of impact on sort of future interactions and sort of thinking about reaching out for help and speaking to others. I wonder if Steve or Heather, sorry, apologies, Steve or Alice, whether you wanted to come in and sort of add anything.
Yeah, I find this really interesting because when the first notice came out about this webinar, I sat down to sort of write my thoughts, and I went, I don't know what stigma I've encountered. I've been really, really lucky. I've got some amazing people around me. I've got, you know, I was just sort of sitting there going, I don't really know what it is. And the more I've thought about it, the more I've realized how much is there. And I think I've sort of, in the spirit of reflecting, it made me kind of realize that internalized approach to it and the fact that, oh, that stuff's just normal. And even doing this work, I hadn't quite registered how serious some of it was. So I've lived with major depression, complex trauma my whole life. I had suicidality for probably certainly since school. I'm not sure when it started. I had a form of multiplicity until I was in my early 30s. I don't know when my first attempt was. I think it depends how you count attempts. The first time I landed in A&E was when I was 30. And actually, that was quite an interesting one because I was living with a woman I'd known from school, you know, my best friend, who reacted incredibly badly. The night it happened, they didn't take me to hospital. They were just like, there you go, just do that and go back to bed. When I did get to the doctor, they were like, it's just an overdose, which was fun. And they misled a lot of people on what had actually happened. I then had this odd experience where I went and talked to a very good nurse. I think they were mental health liaison, but they put the word BPD once in my file, and that didn't come off for about 4 years. And for anyone not familiar, the BPD pathway is very different to other pathways. And I sort of, in reflection again, I'm waiting for an ADHD diagnosis, and this has come in this time round in the last year. Again, not quite sure how to count number of attempts. It's probably somewhere between 5 and 8. This has been very different. It's been sort of quite catastrophic for me. I've experienced some of the worst mental health difficulties of my life. But there's been this strange shift in that I think at the start of this period, when I came in and went, as people do, things are terrible, I don't know how I'm going to go forward, everyone sort of went, oh yeah, no, it's going to be okay. You know, that thing that people do of, it's because of it's because of your illness. And it was only sort of after a month and an erroneous discharge that was very close to another attempt that people started going, oh, okay, this is more serious. And, you know, this led to me having periods of mutism, which anyone who knows me being mute is a very serious thing. I think, strangely, in some ways, now people realize that the suicidality is real. And I think part of this is that it started when I was a young woman, and there are a lot of assumptions around mental health and suicidal gestures, which is a term I loathe, and young women. Now I'm middle-aged, now I'm in my 40s, and it's still there and it's still serious. And I think in some ways that shift is going to allow me to get even, much better support and more appropriate support. But even in this, and I do feel I've been very lucky with the people even the first time 10 plus years ago, I had a line manager who just got on the phone, went, "Have you tried to hurt yourself? What do you need? What can I do?" She was amazing. But one of the organisations I'm linked to, I needed to do a pause to sort of say, I can't do what I'm meant to be doing with you now. And the person I was working with had to keep contacting me during mental health episodes so bad I had multiple attempts of mutism, because they would not accept that I couldn't fill in forms at that point. Even though I had a mental health nurse working with me going, she can't fill in forms. She can't do this. She's not healthy enough to do this. So I think there's still these, even for someone as lucky as me, to have amazing people around, very understanding people around, to have the support of the NSPA, and you guys in and of yourself have been amazing. There's still these things coming in which are actually really quite dangerous. And I think some of the assumptions about someone like me and the assumption that it can't be that bad, there were a couple of near misses. I was discharged at a point when I was very much actively suicidal. And I don't, this speaks to how difficult it is, even for very experienced professionals, to know when someone has moved from at very high risk to a bit safer. But I do think those assumptions about what suicidality and suicide attempts are definitely played into increasing risk.
Thanks so much, Alice. There's kind of quite a few points in there, isn't it? They're so important. And as you said, this point about not making assumptions. But as you were speaking as well, and I was thinking about this, something about engaging with an individual directly when you're talking about your experience in A&E, and actually asking individuals, and for them to use, for you as an individual to use your language, describe things in your own way.
May I come in on that, actually, because this became quite critical when I was under crisis care. The standard question was, are you safe? Anyone who's worked around suicidality, when they leave you at home, they say, are you safe? Roughly meaning, are you going to make an attempt as soon as we leave? I realized that I was struggling to answer this. And this is when people started going, oh, this is a neurodiversity issue as well. Because I thought I was answering honestly. What they were hearing is, I'm safe. What I was trying to say is, oh no, I've got a spreadsheet of options. And I was trying to accurately say, I can't make them work. I don't know how I'm going to do it. But what they heard was, yeah, I'm okay. And we had to sit and go, what words can I use that are accurate, that I will be able to answer? And that was really dangerous, because that communication just wasn't there. Not for any, it wasn't people being irresponsible or anything like that. It was just an understanding, and again, that assumption that I could answer the way they thought I could answer, and actually I couldn't. And it wasn't I didn't want to, I couldn't do it. And so that language and that really attending to the person in front of you, it absolutely critical. Yeah.
Thanks Thanks, Alice. So that piece about communication is so important, isn't it? Which in our everyday lives, going about our work, communication, miscommunication can happen really easily, and actually in a situation like this, so important to be just keeping that in your mind, right? Of not making assumptions, really making sure you've understood what you're hearing. Steve, I'm conscious we've not heard from you yet, and whether you wanted to sort of come in and reflect a bit on your experiences as a suicide attempt survivor, or indeed what Alice and Jeremy have spoken about so far.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, a lot of planning goes into these webinars. Anyone's kind of been involved into this, there's a lot of planning, and then you get to the day, and then you kind of just, you've got your structure and you kind of flow with it. And even though I had the pleasure of kind of taking Alice and other cohort members through, so I know Alice really well, but there's still so much that I'm learning about her experiences and her story. And Jeremy got the pleasure of kind of knowing in the planning stage. And there's something about sitting with experiences and trying to kind of almost step back from kind of a sense of judgment. And I think I share a lot in experiences. And I've briefly mentioned that, I've been involved in mental health services. My mental health difficulties go back to when I was 17 at least, and I'm 41 now. And my primary diagnosis is bipolar disorder, but the underlying diagnosis is complex PTSD. And it's trauma that really characterizes my life and my experiences. I've had 3 periods of very dangerous suicidality. The first time was in 2008, and I would describe that as incredibly scary. The idea of dying was scary. The second time was a year after, and I was consumed with guilt and shame because I'd had my opportunity. I'd seen a psychiatrist, had some care. My best friend had, given me a home and some place to be, and that's what really kind of I was caught up in. So that was 2008, 2009. The next period of very dangerous suicidality was in 2015, and all of that was gone. And I had resigned myself to the fact, and there's still a part of me that is resigned to this fact, that one day it will become too much. The daily challenge will be too much, because I'm ostracized by both my parents, both my siblings and their families, aunts, uncles. There's a very small group of people in my family that I'm even in contact with. And our whole society is built on the model of family. It is reinforced everywhere and in everything. I've got a really blessed life now. I've got work that I enjoy. I've got friends. I've got colleagues. I've got letters after my name. None of that takes any of this away. It does help. I can, a bit more control over my life, but it doesn't take away that pain of being rejected and abandoned. And the reason I'm sharing this is, and it kind of goes to what both Jeremy and Alice have said, which is, well, you didn't really mean it. And for me, one of the most damaging parts and the most damaging experiences that I've had are, well, if you were really serious, you'd have done it. And actually, there are, and I have an issue with religion, but I believe in God. Someone's intervened, because there are things that I've done to myself that should have been the end. I don't know why it wasn't. but actually that there's two things happen, and I, you know, again, it's not that people are overtly bad to me, but you see something change in people's eyes when they find out. Unless I've got the opportunity to kind of really fully explain, and then something shifts. But in passing, or if it's just a short conversation, you see something shift, and it either goes between, well, what have you got to be that depressed about? What have you got to be that kind of, and you've got all these blessings in your life, or, well, it's your own fault. You're not mentally strong enough. There's something about you that can't withstand. And I'm not being funny. And anyone that knows me knows that I am incredibly strong. I'm resilient. I'm all those things. I'm all those buzzwords. And actually, that's part of the challenge. Part of the challenge is it would be so much easier to just lie down. It would just be so much easier to just give in. But I don't want that. I want to live my life. But in doing so, it brings me, my life over the last 15 years has brought me closer to the norm, closer to being around people that have got, I don't have any kids, I'm not married, because my mental illness has taken all that away from me. People are like, you'd be a great dad. I'd be an amazing dad. But I have trouble sleeping. I'm on loads of medication. Like, you see work, Steve? There's a Steve that goes away and has to go and sit in a dark room and has to go and process stuff that I've processed 1,000 times before. So I can't have kids and all these things. And this isn't a sob story. The point of us saying this, and I'm so glad that Jeremy's like 2 years into his journey as an influencer. I mean, by the way, I did not come up with that term. It's a term that we've spoke about quite a lot, but I think it kind of helps at the moment. This is the dream that so many of us have had, is that actually we just don't have enough voices. And it's so important to bring in, me and Jeremy, we're both men, but we're so different. We've both got different life experiences, and there's so much that we can learn because we're not weak. There's nothing wrong with us. And actually, the bit that's very, very, very difficult is we'd like to think that there is no valid reason why somebody should want to take their own life. Actually, there's lots of valid reasons why people want to take their own life. And then that bigger question becomes, well, how do you, stop somebody taking that action to actually think what might need to shift in our society? And for me, I'd just quite like people to butt out of my business. Quite like people to not go, well, you should love your mum. You only get one mum and they're all special. And it's like, you don't know me. You don't know anything about me. And I've had absolute complete strangers chastise me in the shop because I pointed at a mug and went, my mum isn't like that. And they've come over and they've told me, you should love your mum unconditionally. And it's like, do you have any idea what you've just done? That's like walking up to somebody that's got an open wound and sticking your finger in and going, well, it shouldn't hurt. You should be stronger than that. What was the question?
Well, we've been there. Thanks, Steve. I guess our opener, hasn't it, for the webinar is just sort of visiting and talking about different experiences that you each have, and I think that's come across really clearly. And there's a lot in here, isn't there, about how we talk about suicide, how we have these conversations, and that importance of not miscommunication, not making assumptions. And as you say, I think this isn't, and I do just want to, and I can see Alice and Jeremy have got their hands up, although I am conscious we'll need to kind of move on to the second question. So we've got time for the other two. I do just want to take a minute and just recognise that actually all three of you are sharing really quite deeply personal experiences. And just to kind of reminder again, of course, this isn't an easy conversation, and we do need to have more of these conversations around what the experiences of living with suicidality or having experienced a suicide attempt. And it's not easy. So just want to remind everybody again, just to sort of, this is quite a tough subject, and take time if you need to. But thank you so much, Steve, Alice, and Jeremy. I mean, Steve, you made some really, like, quite a few really important points in there, and I think what's coming across strongly for me is the sort of much like everything that we talk about in suicide prevention, it's multifaceted, isn't it? And we need lots of different parts of society, lots of different things in place. It isn't just about effective crisis support. It's thinking about, support that you have around you. It's challenging some of the assumptions that we make and biases that we have, and kind of those default assumptions that we make. And it's just sort of trying to think about that. I'm just, if it's all right, Steve, can we come to Alice and Jeremy, and then and then I think I will have to move us on to the second question. Otherwise, I'm at risk of being a really bad chair today. Alice.
I will try and be brief. I think I'm glad you flagged that there's sort of I think Steve and I have quite similar background in a lot of ways, and I think it's really wonderful to hear Jeremy's perspective, because I think it really speaks to how different the experiences are. I do want to pick up on something Steve said, though, about one of the questions that has kept coming up for me on this is this idea that people choose suicide. I have a real issue with that. The thought of dying by suicide for me is terrifying, but it's also mundanely real. And there is this acceptance that that might be the way I die, because there's this background level of overload and strain that I live with and have always lived with, that just becomes too much. And like Steve, I'm 41, I'm single, no children, and it's not because I didn't want those things, it's because the weight of it is too much. And that noise is constant. It doesn't turn off. And to say that you choose that, like, I know everyone's experience is different, and I'm not saying that there aren't people who make this choice. I'm even open to the idea of rational suicide. I think these are discussions we should have. But I think when you are in a situation where you're living a life where you simply do not have the pieces you need to function, doesn't matter what anyone else can see. It doesn't matter whether people go, oh, you'll be fine. If you don't have those handholds, you can't pull yourself up. And I think we do need to be very careful of this, of overgeneralizing this approach that you will get better, it will be okay. I would love to know what the follow-ups are to 5 years, because maybe people have survived, but are they thriving? Are they still living with depression? And I do think it's different for those of us who have been dealing with these complex issues from childhood, not more or better or worse or good or bad, no value judgment. I think it is different, because this idea of recovery is different when you have these things that I would argue have changed your biology. And I think that needs to be held in mind with these discussions.
Thanks, Alice. Yeah, thank you. Jeremy, do you want to come in?
I will be quick. Just to pick up on a point that Steve raised about religion. It reminds me of the fact that my background is as an Irish Catholic. Part of my recovery that I wanted after my suicide attempt was through the church. I suppose almost a bit of forgiveness, really. And I was quite taken aback by the response of the clergy. insofar as when I told the priest about my suicide attempt, it was a kind of, and so what reaction to it. And I thought, well, maybe it's just him. And so I went to see another priest, and a similar reaction. And what struck me at the time is the church doesn't know how to respond. It doesn't know how to support me in my recovery. So just wanted to add that to Steve's mention of religion.
Thanks, Jeremy. And I think all of this is a really important reminder, isn't it? And I'm thinking about. I know we have a real range of people on the webinar. I will maybe make a little bit of an assumption here myself that people who have joined us today are probably likely to be people quite immersed in the suicide prevention space and working in this area. And of course, you know, some of these things for people on the webinar hearing about those sort of at the sort of more overt stigmatizing and negative responses, like, well, we know that, you know, I wouldn't respond in that way, or we know we shouldn't respond in that way. But it's a helpful reminder, I think, that this happens and it's still out. This kind of stigma and negative responses are out there in wider society, and that I'm thinking about actually how we need to be alive to that fact, because I think sometimes we can feel like things have changed, or, you know, we're in our space and connected to people and not necessarily always aware of these kinds of reactions that are encountered. Thank you so much. Yeah, I will move us on to the next question. We've got I am sort of also having a look at the chat, and there's some great comments that are coming into that, and we'll try and do a bit of a summary towards the end. Thank you for everyone sort of you're engaging and sharing your thoughts and resources. Do keep doing that. So we've sort of reflected a little on the different experiences that you've had and your reflections around that. As I mentioned before, there were a couple of strong themes that came up in the questions, and one was, I guess, really what feels like a lot of anxiety that people hold, and this sort of fear, I think, that people can have, you know, and wanting to kind of know what action can be taken, or what needs to be put in place. How do we have these conversations? And a lot of anxiety around saying the wrong thing, or fear of consequences in terms of systems. And so fear came up as quite a strong theme. And I wonder if each of you could say a little bit about your perspective on the role of fear when it comes to talking about suicide, and particularly following a suicide attempt, and how we can tackle those fears that people have. And Steve, I think we agreed you would be the one to come in on this.
Yeah, I think this flows on really quite well from what Jeremy was saying about, you know, they didn't know how to respond. I think so. A couple of things. Talking about suicide does not make a person more likely to take their own life. We know that. I think the other bit, and on this webinar, we've talked quite deeply about experiences of suicidality. We have not mentioned method or means. And again, that's a really important point to make, and it's a point that, you know, through the influencer training we make very, very strongly. And this is quite a shift. So I think, and I get it, traditionally we want to talk about, it's almost like, well, I took this action, or this person took this action, it's so extreme, that should get people to sit up and listen. But actually, I mean, you know, and I'm incredibly moved by this conversation, even though I've been in the planning stages of it, because actually it is the pain around it that is incredibly powerful. So again, you know, making sure we avoid talking about method and means. I completely get the fear. this is a fearful subject. It is a difficult subject, but just because something is difficult to talk about, it doesn't automatically mean that it's dangerous. And I think part of this is thinking about, by the way, this is skill based. So how we hold difficult conversations full stop is skill based. And part of the reason, it's not a personal virtue. And we've done it in our workplaces. We've all done kind of, different scenario based training, what would you do if X, Y, and Z happens? The bit for me that the fear comes from is, and I have these conversations with Kathy, she's the reason I'm still alive, is she doesn't want me to be in that situation. And she's kind of expressing that pain. Again, I think part of what we need to become more accepting of is that person is in pain. And actually, we need to honor that. We need to find a way to just sit with that person at that point. So asking questions like, do you have intentions of taking your own life? Also taking on board what kind of Alice was saying around kind of, language and making sure we're understood. But all of this is relational. It doesn't take the fear out of it. But we can actually hold really difficult conversations. We do them about lots of different things. The other thing that needs to be said is with the best will in the world, none of us are omnipotent. None of us can control any of this. And people often say to me, well, what if I did X, Y, and Z and that part? And I had this conversation with my private psychologist. We were doing safety plan the other day. And we had to accept that she might do everything right and she care, and none of us are omnipotent. And again, that's also very, very difficult because we want to save them. And somebody mentioned in the chat around kind of cancer, and we want our people, our friends, our family, our colleagues to live. But unfortunately, sometimes that doesn't happen, and that is incredibly painful. That's not anyone's fault. That's not anyone, it's not any one person's responsibility. So yes, that's my kind of stance on kind of fear and the belief that actually we can learn to hold these skillful conversations, that we can hold the difficulty there.
Thanks, Steve. And I suppose this sort of links a bit with, what is often talked about is sort of training and support. And as you say, this is sort of about skill. And so how we can help. And I guess it's maybe, do you think there's something about recognizing that actually should the expectation be that every person can have a conversation about suicide? There are different kind of levels of skill and confidence, and is it helping people? I was thinking actually when you were talking, and Alice might want to come in here, in one of the planning conversations we're having about boundaries, and maybe it links to your point about omnipotence, that people feel perhaps they need to know the right thing to do, and some of it is about knowing, particularly with family and friends or not professionals, of knowing when to maybe try and speak about other support that an individual might want, if that makes sense.
It's a team sport, and I don't mean to, that's not meant to sound crass. We do it with so many things. We do it within our families, our friendship groups, our, if you're part of a neighbours association at work, we all are comfortable with a certain type of conversation, and there's some that we're just not. I think and if you look at the different and some people have developed something 3 minutes to save a life. There's the zero suicide prevention training, which again is about holding you know, if you have a feeling that somebody is, you know, in a dangerous place, how you have that conversation is quite blunt. And then I think there are different types of conversations, and part of this is we know where we are and we know where we want to be. And we kind of have the bits in the middle, but we need to work some of this out. So I'm not going to sit here and go, you should be able to, within any situation, kind of go, you know, we know exactly. But this is all part of it. And in the same way that, I don't know, with any development in the workplace, for example, and we'll kind of put it there, you have to go and figure it out. And actually, it might be that you do a very rapid assessment of your skills and communication training. Actually, are we trained in having these conversations? Actually, it might be that I'm making a massive assumption that actually all organizations have actually really kind of already invested in communications training of any real form. And that's the real first point. And then you kind of go, well, actually, who, do we want to have somebody in the office who, might be that they're already a mental health first aider, or they already hold some sort of role that actually they're more capable of having this conversation. So again, there isn't a strict roadmap to this, but it's not impossible to think as a group, how can we hold this? And again, it's not just thinking about what's going on in that crisis point, but actually, as a group, we wouldn't suggest that someone that's got a severe nut allergy is weak. We understand that that's a response from their body, from their immune system, that we might not understand, but you don't have to understand. No one's telling you to understand it. But you're not going to sit there and throw peanuts at them and mock them for it, because that would be absolutely ridiculous. And that again is kind of, to Jeremy's point and with his colleague, there's something about not treating people who have had an experience of suicidality as if they are made of glass and if they are fragile. They're not that, it's something that happened and they may never have the suicidal period ever again, or they may experience it on a regular basis. Doesn't make them broken, doesn't make them fragile. Just means that that is how their body and their brain are responding to circumstances that by and large we do not understand, but we can have compassion and we can be caring.
I think that's absolutely key, isn't it? That recognition. We can have compassion and care. Thank you, Steve. Alice or Jeremy, did you want to come in at all? Is there anything you wanted to share or respond to in what Steve's talked about?
Yeah, there are a couple of points just to follow up on that. Because the initial reaction, one of the initial reactions to my suicide attempt was to really knock my confidence. And I lived a few years of not feeling able to talk about how I was feeling, my mental illness, the suicide attempt, for fear of being knocked back. And it was purely by chance that I was invited to speak at a mental health first aid training course. And in fact, one of the instructors is on this afternoon session, and he may well remember this. But I was invited to give my lived experience. Unbeknown to me, there were 4 delegates on the course from the place that I worked at. My initial reaction is, I wish I wasn't here. And then it was a case of, well, I am here now. I have to get on with it. I've nothing to lose. And the reactions were good, but it took me nearly 5 years to pluck up the courage to talk about my experience. And then the second point is, it was also very difficult to talk to my wife about my illness, which she knew nothing about, or the suicide attempt. And that took weeks, months of slowly progressing to a point where we both felt comfortable with what I was telling her she was hearing, what she was asking. And what it made me realize is that I needed her support and care as much as she needed to hear from me what I'd been through. And it's almost as though we were caring and supporting each other.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. That's really, I don't think I've heard a reflection in that way of sort of sharing, you sharing what you'd been through, and that was something that was mutually what you and your wife needed. I think that's a really, really powerful insight, actually, that I'd not thought about it in that way before. And I think there's something here, and again, this sort of courage and sort of feeling able to talk about what's happened, and how, people, I can see in the chat that people are talking about the importance of discussing this subject, tackling the misconception. I think Adele put a point in the chat about talking about suicide doesn't put the idea in somebody's head, because so many people do still have that misconception. But I think what I'm struck by as well with some of what people have been saying is actually we need to be creating more spaces to have these conversations and just hear different experiences, because actually if we're really going to change services, systems, or do the things in terms of what's needed to change in society, we have to sort of normalize having these conversations, and it isn't easy because there aren't any kind of necessarily there aren't simple solutions to this. I don't know if solution is quite the right word I want to use, but I think you kind of understand what I'm getting at, hopefully. But there's something about shining a light that actually there's a huge range of experiences, and that knock-on impact. Jeremy, you mentioned there sort of it took you 5 years to feel like you could speak about your experience, which is huge. I can see, Steve, you've got your hand up.
It's just the point of the language. I mean, we use this language of, and you just said the word normalize. I think it's very important. But even the idea of normal, and it's like everybody is normal in their own experience. And I again, I think that there is, and there's a question in the chat around actually the, if you've got Bob here who is, wants to talk about his experience of suicidality, and then you've got Jeff here. Actually, Jeff's probably holding a lot of pain and a lot of fear. So actually, it's probably quite difficult there. And again, I think what Jeremy just discussed is actually sometimes these things take time, and you can't force it. Because actually, we don't want to break each other. We don't want to break each other. And again, this is some of the stuff that marks this as being so different from anything, even perhaps other mental health conditions, where actually, and it goes to Alice's point around there's some idea maybe that this is a choice rather than a response. And actually, this, how do we keep, and it is incremental growth, and I think, but how do we, if everybody on this call went home, and I'm not even talking about suicidality necessarily, but went home and shared something with someone really significant to them that they haven't shared with them before, that would help that person to understand them better. That's a start. So again, it's, for me, a lot of this is about, we talk about suicide as if it's over here and the rest of life as if it's over here. And the third question, which I think we've kind of got to a little bit, was around exploring the role of support, family, friends, social networks. And I think we have discussed some of that, but we kind of put suicide over here and it's so far away from everything else. Actually, there's a lot of the skills we use in every single day actually we need to just adopt those and have that bravery and have that courage to just say, I don't know what you're going through, and I probably cannot fix it, but I will sit with you and I will listen, and I might have my boundaries, and I might go, that's enough for today. Chances are that that person that's talking to you is going to recognize that, because guess what? People who have experienced suicidality are not monsters. Alice.
I just kind of want to pick it up. One of the things I was reading in the run up to this was a paper about the difference between suicidal thoughts and intention and suicidal action. And it's only about a 3-year-old paper, and it was saying we still don't know what it is that makes people tip from one to the other. And we know risk factors, but we don't actually know what it is. And I was reflecting on my own experiences and going, yeah, I'm not sure why on this day I made an attempt, but then the next day I didn't. I'm not sure, because I wasn't feeling better. I wasn't okay, but there was something different. And I think that uncertainty around suicide attempts is part of where that fear comes from. Human beings, we like to know what's going on. You know, the reason terrorism is so frightening is because it feels arbitrary. We don't know where it's going to land. We don't know who it's going to hit. And I think suicide is a bit like that. We don't actually know where that tipping point is. We don't know what it is and why that is the moment that it goes. And I think that is frightening. I think that's fundamentally frightening. And I think what this idea of sitting with that discomfort and with that fear is absolutely the core of good practice and the core of how you look after people on all sides of this discussion. Because like I said at the start, I have supported people with suicidality. I've sat in A&E with a loved one, and it's frightening. It is frightening. And I think accepting this fear and the fact that you, like Steve just said, you can't fix it, is actually really helpful. I think that's really helpful.
Thanks, Alice. And I can sort of see there's a lot going on in the chat in terms of discussion as well. And this sort of, I mean, I think I'm struck by kind of Alice and Steve, two, you know, things that you've both said. One is sort of that, as you say, sitting with the fear, but not underestimating the value of listening and compassion. And, you know, it's not, we haven't spoken about this in the webinar, but I know what's come up in discussions is that so much of this is about is relational and about human connection, and actually not forgetting how powerful that is. I'm doing quite a bad job of chairing. 20 to 3, so we've got 20 minutes left. We had another question around kind of support, I guess, around people and thinking about family, friends, support networks, and that can be very different for different people. And that's sort of been peppered, I think, through the conversation that we've had. If Alice, Steve and Jeremy, you're okay with this. I know, Alice, there were some things you kind of wanted to reflect on here. I wonder if you're okay if maybe we give you, if Alice, you want to say something around this, but I can see there are questions in the chat as well. So it would be nice to just make sure we've got a little bit of space for questions as well. So yeah, so our sort of final question was around the role of support around an individual, which I think chimes with there's questions coming up in the chat around kind of what to say to people around an individual, family, friends, others.
I will keep it really brief then. I think there's a couple, I think maybe I can put it in 3 points. One is keep your conversation simple. As everyone has said, you know, you don't want to overload people. You don't want to stress people. One of the best examples I heard was from a police officer saying in their force, they had introduced just say, are you thinking of suicide, or are you having suicidal thoughts? And they had found it so valuable because it destigmatized it and it allowed people to speak. So keeping it clean and simple, I think, is really helpful. I think always remember that assumptions have real life consequences, and really reflect on your assumptions, conscious and unconscious, that kind of unconscious bias. And the last thing is probably the hardest thing, and that is sometimes it's for professionals, but I think this is more for sort of friends and family and loved ones. It's knowing that you might not be the right person at a particular moment. And it's a very difficult thing to sit with. One of my attempts, there was a moment where I just didn't want to see any members of my family. And one of the professionals involved went, "Can I just check why?" And the answer was just, they deal with this in a way that I can't cope with right now. And it wasn't anything more complicated than that. I didn't not like them. I wasn't angry with them. I just knew how they would deal with it, and I knew I couldn't cope with it at that moment. And accepting that sometimes you are not the right person is both, I think, a relief for you sometimes when you're trying to fix it and going, actually, maybe I can't, but also it spreads that load and goes, actually, it's not up to one person, it's up to a whole bunch of people, and different people will be needed in different stages, and that's okay.
Thanks, Alice. There's some really, helpful reflections in there, and it's, again, it's coming back to it is difficult. I think one thing again that I'm reminded of as well, and then we'll come to questions, is I recall, I think it was our launch webinar for this campaign, and another of our lived experience influencers, Emma, was actually talking about, in her experience as a suicide attempt survivor, what she's found over the years is actually having some of these conversations about how you want to be supported or what's needed, and outside of when somebody's in crisis. So actually, you have those conversations that can then help in those moments when it's maybe quite difficult to be able to advocate for a person to advocate for themselves, or sort of be able to say what they need. There's a lot of, I feel like there's a huge amount of food for thought in, of what's being covered in the webinar today. Loads going on in the chat, and I have sort of tried to keep half an eye on it. I can just see Steve sort of comment on the end there, accept that you might not be the right person at that moment, a huge learning point for me. And that's so very much what we wanted to get across today, is get us all reflecting. And on that point, I'm actually going to come to a question that Neil has posed. And he's asked the question, when someone that is close to you that denies or diminishes your experience, say it was because of X, Y, or Z, or tries to explain your suicidality away, do you think part of this is that it's actually they can't cope with that enormity, or don't have the language or experience to process it? And at this point, I'm just going to invite people to come in with any responses or reflections.
I think it certainly can be. And I think it comes back to that need for control, and sort of go, this feels very out of control. So if I can explain it, I know I've certainly experienced this with self-injury as well. People kind of decide what it is when they haven't spoken to you. I think it's just worth bearing in mind that some people do it maliciously. It can be done maliciously. It can be a kind of gaslighting. And I think you can be very sympathetic to somebody, but you can also say that's not right, and be able to say that you are putting words into my mouth. I think it's about being respectful and kind, but also going, actually, you can't encroach on you can't take my experience. You can't define that.
Thanks, Alice. I see Steve has his hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. I think actually having language to hand is really, really important. And as I'm sat here, I'm kind of struck by a question. By the way, we can see the questions, but as panelists, we can't engage with them, so we can't even like them. So that's kind of, we are reading them. But I think Alice, Adele's question around the impact on families, especially children, around someone who's attempted suicide. I think there's probably a gap here when I think about the resource, and particularly there's the booklet. I can't remember the name of it now. It's got the flower on the front.
Help is at hand.
Help is at hand. That's a really kind of helpful resource that was co-developed, and that's around, what to do if someone has died. And it almost feels there's a bit of a gap here, that a gap that we've identified as kind of being suicide attempt survivors is, well, actually, how does the family live with the knowledge that this person wanted to take their own life, any kind of position in the family? So there's probably a gap there. Because again, what kind of happens is it feels like you get this position where it's the individual who's experienced suicidality bearing a lot of responsibility, but also then the family kind of holding that. I think the difficult thing is, and say, for example, someone that's had cancer, you're in remission. People are very, very cautious to say that they've been cured, even if it's after, kind of say 5 years, because there's always that knowledge that it could come back. And if it came back, we wouldn't blame that person. And we do kind of live with that uncertainty. So again, kind of, none of us are omnipotent. Yes, this person went through something. They may never go through that again, or they may do. And I think that this is where there's probably a gap in support. I'd be careful to not rush to kind of it being like, we need to kind of have much more services. Actually, part of it might even be, this is a guide, a bit like Help is at Hand, that kind of puts some stuff down. How do you have a conversation? How do you even prepare for it? And sometimes it's as simple as going, I'm the person that's had this suicidality. I really want to talk about this. I know that you will need time to prepare. What does that look like for you? Or the other way around, kind of, I really want to know a bit more about kind of what was leading you up to this point. And again, these are all things that are skillful. So perhaps as a community, this is something that we could kind of pull together and think, we got to address the gap there.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks. I think you sort of answered another question in there, and a comment from Sorab, who I think may now have left the call, but there's something that question around, and this is so, it's deeply distressing for all, and in a person that is in that crisis, or has attempted suicide and been through that experience, understandably, distressing and upsetting for people around the individual. And there is something in there about, is there enough support, and are we looking at some of these areas enough in terms of helping people understand and helping kind of move through that? Because of course, if you're coming into a sort of situation both holding feelings and distress, it's incredibly difficult to have some of those conversations. So there's definitely something there, isn't there, about ensuring we sort of think about the support that's needed all round, and how we can use some of the conversation that we've had today. I can see Jeremy has his hand up as well. Jeremy, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, people's response to talking about suicide is really complex. And yeah, people not talking about it can be, they don't know what to say, so ignorance. It can be the fear of planting the seed. But from my own experience, interestingly, my younger son, we rarely talk about my suicide attempt, because for him, it is sufficient to know that I'm still here, and that's all he wants to know. what he's asked is that if I'm struggling, I talk to him and I tell him. Similarly with my wife worried an awful lot in the years that followed. If I was late home from an event and she didn't know I was going to be late, she would start to panic and relive some of the trauma. But in saying that, both my wife and younger son were very supportive and helpful when I needed crisis intervention in the last 12 months. I had 2 periods in the last 12 months where I was under the crisis team, and it was a collective choice that that's what I needed. And it was through the conversations with them that encouraged me to go.
Thank you, Jeremy. That's really that's amazing to hear that. And I think it's again, it's just reinforcing this point for me that the more we have conversations and come with that sort of openness, curiosity, non-judgment, that this is difficult. It's not easy to talk about, but you know, having that agreement in place, I think that's really, really powerful that you shared that. Thank you, Jeremy. I find that whenever we run a webinar, there's always so many questions, and I think although we haven't kind of read lots of the questions out, I think quite a few of them we have covered, certainly in some of these latter reflections since we opened it up. I think there's some questions around there about, you know, stigma, multiple stigmas, and sort of communities that might experience greater stigma than others, and that being a barrier. I mean, I'd encourage people to have a look on the Stigma Hub on our website, because there's lots of different information and resources on there. I think we probably do need to just wrap up now, and I've got a bit of a summary of themes. Mari in the background has kind of been pulling out some of the themes that have kind of come out quite strongly in today's conversation. Alice, I saw you had your hand up, but I don't know. Was there something that you wanted to kind of come in?
Just a quick one, because I did see something pop up about long-term support. I've reflected on this quite a lot this year, and I'd just like to offer, if someone has said, I can't do this, I can't do that, I now think of it more like I would if it was a student saying, I can't do this work, I can't do that work, and go, well, why do they feel like they can't do it? If someone says, I don't have people close to me, even if you think they have, they don't feel it. And I think that kind of empathy, that kind of intellectual empathy, can really help build longer term solutions and really person-centered solutions. So just to reflect on that question, because I saw it pop up.
Thanks, Alice. And thank you. I think, you know, and there's some you know, I'm sure you may well be having a look in the chat, but it sounds like people have taken away quite a lot from today's webinar. And I just want to thank each of you for being so generous with your time and kind of sharing so personally about your experiences. I think it's been incredibly powerful. I think just to sort of reflect on some of the key some of the themes that we feel have emerged from the conversation today, some of the things that we've made a note of, this fear and anxiety around conversations and feeling anxious about discussing suicide. But it's important to recognise that having the conversations itself doesn't increase risk, and there's this being open and compassionate is more helpful than getting wording perfectly right. We've talked about kind of stigma and social reactions, and you know, we really need to reflect on our own assumptions and biases to help create a more understanding and accepting environments. You know, the importance of support systems, but actually recognizing that different people have different support systems or may not have support, and we're not omnipotent. you know, we don't necessarily have all the answers, but what matters is showing up, listening and being present. Challenges in professional and crisis care. So, you know, there are miscommunications, being misunderstood, or things happening, not, you know, being discharged before feeling safe. And that kind of person-centered, trauma-informed support is so important and can help prevent further distress. Personal and societal assumptions about suicide, and we really need to challenge those. You know, saying someone chose suicide, and we really have to challenge some of these assumptions that we're making. Communication and listening are absolutely key skills. That active listening, patience, and sitting with the discomfort. I think the thing that's come out incredibly strongly is everybody's individual, and actually we need to recognise people's different experiences of suicidality, and there's not a single path to recovery. And then finally, there's something about the need to have more of these conversations, maybe normalising. I know we've sort of challenged that there's sort of a certain something implied in that, but there's something about having these open and honest conversations about suicide and making it more, getting used to, you know, having more conversations like this, so that we can really shine a light on these different experiences, but thinking about safe, responsible language. So I think there's a huge amount to take away from today, and I think a personal thing for me is there's something about this is about being human. So I think I just want to say thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I know we've had sort of getting a bit of a drop off now. There is a feedback form on the screen. We'd really value you just taking a minute to fill that out. I hope you can go away from today and well, from the session now, and maybe take some time for yourself. I appreciate we touched on some really, really difficult and, you know, challenging things today, and that's been in the spirit of just trying to get us to reflect. I think it is that message of let's be kind to ourselves, be kind and compassionate in this space. We're all working, you know, we all want to kind of work towards the same things. But I do hope, yeah, people can have a bit of time out this afternoon and sit with what we've spoken about in that spirit of kind of non-judgment, openness, and just sort of see this as about helping us reflect. So, and I think there's probably some support has been put in the chat if anyone would find that helpful and needs to sort of chat following the today's webinar. And I think that's everything for today. And as I say, just to say, you know, thank you again to our speakers for joining us today, and thanks everybody for staying with us and yeah, joining us in this conversation. It's been incredibly powerful from my perspective.